Hey guys, it's Shannon from That DIY Couple, and today I'm going to be making a video in English describing the differences between Brazil and the United States. So, as a lot of you guys know, I speak Portuguese fluently. I lived in Brazil for a couple of years, and I wanted to talk today about a couple of the differences that I noticed between living there and the United States. The first difference is that in Brazil, they have a number of informal jobs in the informal economy that just don't exist in the United States. For example, when you go out to dinner or something in Sao Paulo, you can leave your car on the street, but if you do that and there's no one around, it's entirely possible that someone will rob you or try to steal your car. So there's an entire sector of people who wear these little reflective vests oftentimes called flanelinhas, which literally means little towel. I'm not sure exactly why. I think it means little towel. And they are essentially a informal job that has sprung up due to this problem where they will watch your car. Unfortunately, if you don't pay them, like a couple of Brazilian reais, which is the currency there, they might slash your tires or rob your car too. So it's a little bit of a weird situation where you're essentially forced to pay for this thing because the problem exists, and then this service has sprung up around it. The other thing that is very common in Brazil is to have a maid. And there's a lot of controversy about this because oftentimes they're not really paid a living wage, despite the fact that there are now a lot of laws on the books in Brazil that try to regulate this and make sure that they have a living wage and benefits. A friend of mine wrote his thesis about, the maids have maids, a look at, the service industry in Brazil. It's so common that oftentimes the people who have maids have their own maids, and there's different levels. You sometimes have multiple people who live with you, or one person who lives with you who does everything in your house and takes care of your kids. And honestly, it's a little bit uncomfortable as an American because you feel almost like this is an indentured servant or something like that, just because the economic disparity between the two groups is so high. This is also something that exists in other parts of the developing world. Like in India, it's not uncommon for you to rent an apartment and for it to just come with a guy who lives there and takes care of things for you. And so one of the things that I found interesting was when I arrived was that because the cost of labor to clean your house is so much less in Brazil, everyone basically has a maid, and the houses are just immaculate. You walk in and everything is just pristine. When I got to my friend's house in the interior of Sao Paulo, which is the countryside, I was shocked because I went to sleep and then the next morning all my laundry had been washed and folded. Even my shoes had been washed. So this is a common thing to wash your tennis shoes and keep your tennis shoes in good condition. And I think she had used a toothbrush to clean my tennis shoes, and it was kind of shocking for me and a little bit off-putting. But also sort of nice because it was wow, I wish I had. It's almost like having a really nice mom, but complicated as well due to all the economic. Anyway, so that was different. Another profession that exists in Brazil that just doesn't exist in the United States is that there are a lot of people who stand outside restaurants and even in the food court of the mall and just can show you the menu. And this exists sometimes in the US where you see the guy kind of handing you little pieces of chicken or whatever in front of the Panda Express to get you to taste something. But in Brazil, it's much here's the menu, let me walk you through it. It's a hand-holding exercise. And you walk into a store in the mall and there's somebody in there who's ready to accompany you while you shop and tell you how you look in this thing or look good in this and bring you new clothing. And that exists to some extent in the United States, but in Brazil I found it to be much more aggressive. For me, it felt aggressive as an American, but in Brazil it's a service that is kind of expected and not seen as aggressive. So those are some of the differences in the service culture in Brazil versus the US. Another big difference between Brazil and the US is how bureaucratic Brazil is. It's incredibly difficult to start a new company, and if you want to do anything in the world of business, you have to get all sorts of stamps from all sorts of different government agencies, and it can oftentimes delay business for a very long time to a greater extent than in the United States. A third difference between Brazil and the United States is that Brazil has this concept of who sent you. It's called the quem indicou, who sent you. And so that's the idea that if you're applying for a job or something, it's much more important to know somebody at the company and have that person recommend you than to be, for example, well qualified. Now, I think you can argue that that's also important here, and there's no doubt about it that having an in or having an inside contact for anything, be it college applications or a job or anything like that, can be helpful, but it's it's almost like an essential in Brazil, which is a little bit different than here. One little anecdote is that I was staying with my friend's family in the countryside of Sao Paulo, and her dad was kind of a big deal in this very small town because he was the owner of the public notary, which is an incredibly prestigious position in Brazil and something that earns a lot of money. And the mom told me when I arrived, if you ever have any issues or need anything, just let them know that you're staying with us. And I thought, wow, I'd studied it. Like, that's the Cain and Co. who sent you in action. But I never wanted to use it. I never felt comfortable using that trump card. And so until I got bit by a dog and had to go to a sort of urgent care clinic and was waiting for like 5 hours to see anyone. And eventually at the end of 5 hours, I was so fed up that I went to the friend and I was like, hey, did I mention that I was staying with yada yada, her dad's name? And they said, oh, I didn't realize. And 5 minutes later, I was seen. And so this is like I think a pretty big difference between the United States and Brazil. So another big difference, speaking of that, is that to be a notary public in Brazil is an extremely lucrative and high-paying profession. Because of the bureaucracy, every time you have a baby or get divorced or get married or someone dies, you have to go to the notary, which is a physical location that you have to go to in your town, and stamp many documents with official seals, and then records are taken. And every time you do that, there's large there's large fees that you have to pay to the notary. And this is a position that was historically passed down from a dad to a son to another son over time, and has only recently been sort of democratized, where it's not necessarily inherited and you have to take a test in order to become it. So this is like a very different concept, because here basically anybody can be a notary. It could be quite easy to become a notary. Most secretaries at major law firms and corporations are notaries, and getting anything notarized is not a big deal. You're not going to pay more than $5 to get something notarized. Another big difference between Brazil and the United States is that in Brazil, perhaps because of all of their history of dictatorship and presidents, changes of state and the army taking control and large scandals breaking over their news there about corruption in the government, there's a general sense of distrust of government and a suspicion of corruption of government officials. This is, I think, somewhat different than the United States. There's certainly in the era of Trump and the current era that we're currently living in a sense of growing suspicion that, not trusting our press and people saying things are fake news and things like that. And there is a sense of, I bet, these Washington guys are just padding their own pockets and things like that. But I would say that it's still quite a bit less than the suspicion in Brazil. I think that in general, Americans' confidence in their public institutions and in their elected officials is quite high compared to certain other places in the world, including Brazil. Another difference between Brazil and the United States is that it's when you go out in Brazil, you have to be careful about getting robbed in most places. And in some places in the United States, that is the case, but I would say it's not the case in most places. Another difference is that in Brazil, it is obligatory to vote. If you don't vote, you can face fines and you can have your license suspended. In the United States, it's entirely optional. Another difference is that Brazil is a very Catholic country, and religion plays a great role in people's lives. I think it's similar to the United States. The role of religion is less in major metropolitan areas and more in rural areas, but almost everywhere people identify as Catholic, and it's not, super uncommon to have little cards that you carry with you that have your favorite saint on them that you can sort of recite or do like a rosary or something like that. It's not uncommon to have a little statue of your favorite saint and give them a little bit of coffee in the morning, the very first cup of coffee. And then there's a lot of influence of African religions in the north of Brazil. There's a practice called candomblé, which is a Catholicism sort of mixed with some of the religions that came along with the African diaspora. So it's a different, similar to being in parts of Europe, religion plays a larger role, I think, than in the United States. Although I will say that I think that in general the United States is a fairly religious country. I think that the practice of it is slightly more overt there. Another big difference between Brazil and the United States is that in Brazil it is very rude to not greet somebody and say goodbye to them in a social gathering situation. So when you arrive at a party, it's incredibly important to greet everybody, and when you leave the party, it's incredibly important to say goodbye to every single person. So saying goodbye can take like an hour because you have to go around to every person and then you end up chatting with them, and it's just, if you don't do that, people will be like sort of frustrated with you and they'll find you quite rude. In the United States, I think it's a little bit more acceptable to just kind of ghost when you're ready to leave a party and leave without saying goodbye. Another thing that's more common in Brazil at parties is to make out with a lot of people at one party. I think that Brazil has a perception of being extremely sexualized, and this probably plays into it. One thing that's interesting to note is that while people will go to parties and oftentimes kiss lots of people and make out, I actually think it's less common for people to randomly hook up and have sex as opposed to like the image that Americans have of Brazil. Usually what happens is people will go out and kiss a bunch of people and then go home separately. But this is just not that common in the United States. It's not common when you're 13, 14, 15 years old to go out and kiss many, many people. So I will say that Brazilians are quite good kissers because they're quite practiced. So one last difference is that Brazilians make intense eye contact by American standards. So in the United States, we know that eye contact is important. It's an important part of like presenting yourself well, particularly like in a job interview situation or just being polite. But in general, I would say that American eye contact is, eye contact, then you look away. Eye contact, then you look away. And it's not intense and continuous. And intense and continuous eye contact, when you're looking directly into another person's eyes for a prolonged period of time, like having a conversation and continuing to stare directly into their eyes, feels extremely intimate, right? Especially without blinking. It's almost like intense, and it's almost like a sexual thing, and you feel like they're like undressing you with their eyes. And so when I arrived in Brazil and everybody was staring at me directly into the eyes, I found it to be quite intense. And I thought, wow, all these people must be really attracted to me, like men and women. They must be very attracted to me because they're all just like essentially like, but they're all looking at you like very intensely. So I learned though that is simply a cultural thing. So moms will correct their kids, like, look at that person, they're talking to you, look at that person directly in the eyes. And so looking away is seen as rude, and so therefore it doesn't have the undertones that I might attribute to it being an American. So that's it, you guys. Those are my big observations about differences between Brazil and the United States. If you like this video, please hit like and subscribe. Comment down below if you have questions or ideas for other videos for us to do. Have a great day, guys. Bye.